Throughout the feudal period, farmers used the three-field method of farming. One field was planted in the autumn, usually in wheat or rye. A second field was planted in spring, this time either in barley for making beer, water was often unfit to drink in those days, or in beans, peas, and oats. A third field was left fallow or unplanted. The purpose of the latter was to preserve the fertility of the soil. Each year a different field was left fallow. It was plowed but not planted. The serf strips of land were spread throughout these three fields. Some serfs owned only a small amount of land, but others possessed as much as 30 acres. Serfs were usually free to work their own fields 3 days a week. The rest of the week, except for Sunday, was given over to the Lord's land. On his own strips, the serf could grow fresh vegetables or whatever he wished, but he was required to give a certain portion of his harvest to his Lord. The Lord also received a portion of the serf's chickens, pigs, and livestock. The serf's duties extended beyond the Lord's fields. He might have to run errands for his Lord's lady, and he certainly had to have his grain ground in the Lord's mill for a fee. The same held true for the Lord's oven for baking and his wine press for turning grapes into wine. The serf had to cut his firewood and hay on the Lord's land and give a portion to his Lord. In times of extra work, such as building, planting, or harvesting, the serf could be called on to haul stone, plow, sow, and harvest. There is more. The serf's agreement with his Lord required him to give extra on feast days. For example, at Christmas, he might have to give one of his best fowl, on Palm Sunday to come forward with a sheep, and on Easter with 5 eggs. Serfs hardly ever had a minute to rest. Even so, Sundays, feast days, and perhaps a week at Easter and Christmas were holidays. On these days, he gathered with fellow serfs and their families for sports and other activities. These and other amusements are covered later in this packet. Serfs' wives and daughters also worked hard. When not laboring in the fields alongside the menfolk, they helped out in the manor house. They spun cloth and made clothing. They baked bread and brewed beer. These tasks were in addition to those they were expected to perform in their own huts. At the end of the serf's long workday, he retired to his humble hut. The typical hut was built of wood and had 1 or 2 rooms, with rushes covering the dirt floor and a thatched roof. If it had windows all the time, there were only slits covered with oiled cloth. In the center was a hearth for cooking and heat. With no chimney, smoke went up out a hole in the roof. More than one hut went up in flames because of this not too satisfactory arrangement. Because the thatched roofs of the huts were usually set on fire, cooking was often done outside when the weather was good. Serfs produced their own food, which was just as plain as the quarters in which they lived. They ate a diet of black bread and vegetables such as cabbage, carrots, and onions. They also had dairy products and some pork. Water was usually unsafe to drink, so they drank mostly ale. They had no sugar, no potatoes, no tea, and no coffee. They did have salt, but only in limited amounts. They seldom ate meat. Contrary to what some people might believe, the short life expectancy of the average serf, some 30 years, probably had little to do with diet. Black bread is chock full of vitamins and nutrients, and no one ever died early from eating cabbage and garden vegetables. And, from what we know about nutrition and health, serfs are better off not eating a lot of meat. Their short lives were probably due to hard work and the total absence of hygiene and sanitation. The latter gave rise to diseases that took the lives of many on the manor, serf and lord alike. Men of all ranks wore tunics, with the length of the tunic and the brightness of its colors signifying rank. Serfs wore a short woolen or sheepskin tunic and trousers that were held secure by either knee-high stockings or leggings or thin leather. The tunic had sleeves and slipped over the head like a sweatshirt. The serf also wore either a belt or a piece of rope that kept the tunic in place around the waist. He completed his attire with leather boots. In winter, he added an animal skin cloak and woolen gloves and a hat. The serf's wife dressed similarly, but for a skirt in place of trousers. Daughters dressed like their mothers, and sons dressed like their fathers. Many years had passed before the clothing of children ceased to be smaller versions of those of their parents. After a week of hard work, the serf and his family looked forward to Sunday. Sundays and feast days were days of rest and amusement. Serfs got together and sang, danced, and played games. One game that was popular among boisterous young men was an early kind of soccer between the two towns, called mob football. It was played in the streets, and considering the amount of ale the players had drunk beforehand, tended to get a little rough. Broken bones and gouged eyes were commonplace, and sometimes players were killed. The game became so rough that church officials outlawed it in some places. But it mattered little if football was banned. There were other sporting activities to keep roughnecks occupied. They wrestled, they had weightlifting contests, and engaged in anything that afforded them competition. To the hard-working serf, Sundays and feast days were a time to let off steam. Occasionally, a serf who could no longer endure conditions on the manor would run away. To do so was chancy at best. In the early part of the feudal era, when few towns existed, there was really no place to run. In addition, life outside the manor was dangerous, and a runaway serf ran the risk of being killed. There was also the certainty that if he was captured and returned to his lord, he would be subjected to the cruelest of punishments. When more towns began to appear in the 13th century, rulers declared that any serf who ran away and hid for a year and a day was said to be a free person. Many serfs gained their independence in this manner. Others became free when their lords were killed on crusades to the Holy Land. And even more were able to buy their freedom when the Black Death, a terrible disease that raged through Europe, killed 1/3 of the continent's population. With the labor force so reduced, serfs were able to bargain for their freedom, or at least for more rights in return for working the land.